In 1571, Michel de Montaigne, at 38 years old and with a solid career as a magistrate in Bordeaux, made a decision that baffled those around him. He left public service and retired to a circular tower on his family estate. This was not an ascetic gesture, nor an aristocratic whim. Montaigne was seeking something that his era could barely name, an inner space where he could observe the movement of his own mind and understand why worry. That constant tension that distorts life more than events themselves dominated both his contemporaries and himself. He intuitively sensed that, to discover what happens when one stops living under that invisible weight, he had to start by studying the root of human unease itself. The tower, with its 3 floors and its library adorned with Latin inscriptions, became the laboratory for an unprecedented literary and intellectual experiment. There, surrounded by ancient authors and the silence of the Périgord countryside, he experimented with a novel form of writing focused not on doctrines or moral examples, but on the direct exploration of individual experience. To understand why this retreat marked a turning point in the history of Western thought, it is necessary to reconstruct the world from which Montaigne withdrew. France was going through one of the most violent and disorienting periods in its history. The wars of religion, which had been pitting Catholics against Huguenots since 1562, had fractured the kingdom to its core. Monarchical authority weakened with each new outbreak of violence, while cities lived under a climate of suspicion that permeated both public and private life. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, with thousands of Protestants murdered in just a few days, symbolized for Montaigne the extreme to which a country dominated by unshakable certainties and sectarian passions could descend. This was not just a political crisis. The French Renaissance had spurred the systematic recovery of classical texts and fostered a scholarly culture open to debate. However, this intellectual drive coexisted with increasing hostility toward any form of heterodoxy. The theological tensions between Catholics and Reformers turned even the slightest dissent into a mortal risk. In universities, courts, and even private homes, intellectual discussion was narrowing under increasingly rigid doctrinal pressures. Montaigne lived this contrast directly. In Bordeaux, he administered justice in an institution meant to uphold civil order, while outside the walls of the Parliament, everyday life was crumbling into a mixture of fear, rumors, and ritualized violence. This context explains why the essayist distrusted discourses that promised absolute truths. For him, any conviction presented as indisputable carried with it the possibility of becoming an instrument of oppression. The civil wars showed him that dogmatism was not merely an intellectual error, but a devastating social disease. In a kingdom where crowds killed one another in the name of doctrinal purity, Montaigne began to sense that the only way to resist this destructive logic was by cultivating a different relationship with one's own mind, a relationship capable of living with doubt, contradiction, and human fragility. But his retreat cannot be understood without examining the origin of his intellectual sensitivity. Montaigne was born in 1533 in the family castle, in a region where Renaissance humanism had found fertile ground. His father, Pierre Ayquem, had prospered as a merchant and wanted his firstborn to receive an education that would distinguish him both from rural nobility and the rising bourgeoisie. To achieve this, he conceived a radical pedagogical experiment. He ensured that the child learned Latin before French. To do so, he hired a German tutor who did not speak the local language and ordered that everyone in the house, from the servants to the mother, address the child in Latin. This total immersion made Montaigne one of the few Europeans in the 16th century whose emotional and mental language was the same as Cicero's. Pierre Ayquem's method had another crucial dimension. He rejected physical punishment and avoided mechanical memorization. He sought for his son to associate learning with pleasure and curiosity, not with obedience. This early education shaped in Montaigne a deep aversion to any form of authoritarian discipline. It also planted the conviction, which would later define his essays, that the mind only produces fertile knowledge when it moves freely and without coercion. After completing studies in law, Montaigne joined the Bordeaux Parliament, where he worked for more than a decade. His judicial career placed him at the heart of royal administration, decisions about inheritances, commercial disputes, and minor crimes, but also the task of applying laws marked by religious tensions and political rivalries. Although he carried out his duties diligently, he never felt entirely comfortable within the corporate logic of power. Legal rhetoric, veiled negotiations, and institutional rigidity seemed foreign to his temperament. This was compounded by the growing awareness that human justice rarely escaped prejudice and arbitrariness. Amidst his professional life, the event that would shape the emotional and intellectual core of his work emerged: his friendship with Étienne de la Boétie. They met in 1558, and from their first encounter, Montaigne felt that he had found an inner correspondence that required no explanation. La Boétie, author of the surprising discourse on voluntary servitude, was a precocious humanist who examined the psychological and political roots of tyrannical power. Their conversations covered everything from ancient ethics to the art of governing, touching on the fragility of human judgment. With him, Montaigne discovered a form of dialogue where thought unfolded without defenses or calculations. La Boétie's death in 1563 abruptly interrupted this relationship. Montaigne, who accompanied him to the very end, perceived the loss as an interior amputation. For years, he kept his friend's manuscripts, reread as a way to keep the interrupted conversation alive. The intensity of this mourning familiarized him with a central aspect of the human condition: emotional vulnerability. From that point on, Montaigne understood that no philosophical system was solid if it did not address this constitutive fragility. When 8 years later he decided to retire to his tower, it was not driven by misanthropy or a desire for absolute isolation. Rather, it was the need to reorganize his inner life after losing the most important intellectual support of his youth, and after going through a period where public service became an incompatible burden with his reflective inclinations. The death of his father in 1568 reinforced this inclination. Now he was responsible for the family estate, but also free to shape his own time. In a Latin inscription placed in the library, he explained his goal with disarming clarity. He sought freedom, tranquility, and leisure, essential conditions for self-examination without interruption. However, this withdrawal did not equate to indifference to human affairs. Montaigne withdrew precisely to observe more clearly what caused suffering in his contemporaries. He intuited that the origin of unease did not lie solely in wars, royal decrees, or theological disputes, but in a more intimate mechanism: constant worry, that mental habit that transforms any event into a source of anxiety. His diagnosis was simple but penetrating. People chained themselves to impossible social expectations, feared others' judgment, sought honors they did not understand, and obeyed moral codes they rarely examined. The obsession with reputation and the anguish before death turned existence into a permanent struggle against internal ghosts. Montaigne concluded that, if he wanted to understand how the self is formed and deformed, he should begin with himself. This introspective turn was unprecedented in scale within the Western tradition. Ancient moralists had offered practical advice, and medieval theologians had provided manuals to guide the soul toward God. But no one had made the singular self, with its fluctuations and contradictions, the central object of systematic inquiry. In the solitude of his tower, Montaigne embarked on that path. As he progressed in his retreat, Montaigne delved deeper into the idea that the root of human conflict did not reside exclusively in political structures or religious dogmas, but in the everyday difficulty of managing internal anxieties. Writing became a tool to examine these subtle movements: how a trivial thought could trigger persistent worry, how memory shapes present judgments, or how a minor emotion could transform into an overwhelming fear if not recognized in time. In this process, a notion of freedom began to take shape, distinct from the freedom celebrated by the heroic discourses of the time. Not freedom linked to public glory or victory over an external enemy, but the kind that arises when an individual learns not to submit to their own fantasies, habits, or fears. The patient observation of his inner life thus became an exercise in self-governance, rooted in the conviction that self-knowledge is the first step to living less vulnerably to the instability of the world. From this work emerged a new intellectual sensitivity. Introspection ceased to be merely a moral or spiritual tool and acquired an analytical function: to explore the variations of the self in order to understand the complex web that links perception, affection, and judgment. This perspective, still embryonic in the early years of his retreat, already revealed a significant shift. The self began to be conceived as a legitimate subject of study, one that could be described and compared like any natural phenomenon. In Montaigne's tower, this incipient form of research coexisted with the classical legacy that filled his shelves. Without adopting any model as an absolute authority, he engaged in dialogue with the ancients to contrast his own observations, refine them, or question them. This combination of personal experience and critical reading paved the way for the flexible, anti-dogmatic method that would characterize his essays, a method that was not yet fully formulated, but whose seed was already perceptible in the way he examined each movement of his inner life. Through this constant practice of observation, Montaigne opened an unprecedented path in the European intellectual tradition. His approach transformed the view of the individual. The self ceased to be an abstract category and became a dynamic reality that could be studied up close. Inner freedom, Montaigne and the mastery of fear. In the European 16th century, death was not an exceptional event nor a distant limit, but a daily presence embedded in the social experience. The demographics of the time reflect extreme vulnerability. Cities suffered recurrent outbreaks of plague that could wipe out a third of their inhabitants in just a few weeks. Villages were decimated by fevers that today would be considered mild. Complications during childbirth claimed lives with a regularity that shaped family expectations, and children, in particular, lived exposed to a range of diseases that rarely allowed a family to keep all of its children. Even among the wealthy, infant survival was uncertain. Montaigne saw 5 of the 6 children he had with Françoise de la Chassaigne die, a common pattern among the provincial nobility. To these biological circumstances were added the civil wars of religion, with their unpredictable violence, and a judicial system that turned public executions into a pedagogical spectacle. Nothing in that world allowed death to be relegated to an abstract realm. It was embedded in ordinary life and yet dominated the imagination with disproportionate weight. The observation of this paradox, the physical familiarity with death and the psychological terror it produced, led Montaigne to formulate one of his central concerns: how to live without that shadow determining every thought. The moral tradition of his time offered 2 main paths: religious preparation and philosophical training. Both shared the idea that life should be understood as a preparation for death, whether to ensure eternal salvation or to harden the spirit according to the Stoic model. But for Montaigne, these paths posed a problem. They turned present existence into a mere prelude to a future event whose nature was unknown. Life was subordinated to a moment not yet lived, and this subordination generated constant anxiety. The meditation on death, as it was practiced, did not liberate. It intensified the fear it sought to dissolve. The introspective analysis developed during his retreat provided a new framework to address this issue. Montaigne realized that most of the fear of death was a mental construct. It did not stem from direct experience, since no one can fully and consciously experience their own death, but from repeated and reinforced imaginary associations shaped by religious, literary, and social discourses. Death, as it was thought of in his time, was an event saturated with moral and metaphysical meanings. By stripping it of these symbolic layers and examining it as a natural phenomenon, Montaigne discovered that fear diminished. This intuition was solidified after an equestrian accident that profoundly altered his perception of dying. While riding through his lands, a chance blow threw him to the ground, leaving him unconscious. During that liminal state, he experienced a suspension of his usual faculties. He did not feel distress, he did not fight to preserve his life, and he did not formulate structured thoughts. It was a confused, almost pleasant state, which seemed to dissolve the very notion of identity. Upon later reconstructing this experience, Montaigne concluded that the transition to death might not have the drama that the collective imagination attributed to it. The violence of the accident had been extreme, but the subjective process was not. The agony that his time so feared seemed, at least in his case, milder than the anticipated terrors. This experience did not eliminate his concept of death, but it did modify his relationship with it. He stopped considering it as necessarily a painful or terrifying event and began to see it as a physiological transition whose emotional impact depended primarily on prior interpretations. His mature reflection on death distanced itself from both Stoicism and the dominant Christian morality. He agreed with the Stoics in that death should not be a source of panic, but he rejected the rigorous mental discipline they proposed. Constant preparation for death, rehearsing death through anticipatory exercises, seemed counterproductive to him. The mind, by repeatedly imagining its own disappearance, would end up amplifying the fear. The exercise that was supposed to liberate would instead become the source of anxiety. Against this strategy, Montaigne proposed something simpler and more pragmatic. Accept death as part of the natural order without paying it more attention than necessary. The problem was not dying, but living as though death were the axis of every decision. Death did not require training, but a more sober relationship with the imagination. At the same time, he distanced himself from the theological framework that turned the final moment into an absolute judgment. For him, the value of life did not depend on its relationship to an otherworldly fate, but on the quality of the present experience. Death, situated in the future, should not darken the current life. Existence gained meaning not through its instrumental function in relation to salvation, but through its daily practice. Conversing, reading, walking, exercising responsibilities with moderation, cultivating emotional bonds, observing nature. These activities were not mere distractions. They constituted the very substance of the good life. Montaigne's philosophy on the fear of death thus derived from two converging sources: his introspective method and his observation of the social world. The method led him to dismantle the mental associations that fueled terror. His observation of the world showed him the irrationality of living under its dominion. When a plague epidemic reached the Bordeaux region, many fled in panic. Montaigne remained in his castle, not out of negligence or defiance, but because he knew that contagion, or the luck of avoiding it, largely depended on chance. Fear conferred no protection, it only disturbed judgment. This stance did not imply a disregard for life, but an acknowledgement that anxiety does not alter the odds. From this perspective, Montaigne formulated a series of principles aimed at reorganizing the relationship between the individual and mortality. The first was not to mentally anticipate agony. Anticipation, born of uncontrolled imagination, created more suffering than the event itself. The second was to conceive of death as an instant, not as a permanent threat. The third encouraged integrating mortality into daily life without making it an obsession. Death should be accepted as a limit, not as a central argument. With this conceptual reorganization, fear diminished because it ceased to feed on imaginary projections. This intellectual transformation was directly supported by the introspective method described in the previous chapter. Montaigne applied to his fear of death the same principle of non-intervening observation that he applied to other emotions. He examined fear as a mental movement, analyzed its cultural origin, distinguished between the act of dying and inherited representations, questioned implicit premises, and suspended the dogmatic conclusion that death should be feared. This repeated process weakened the automatic link between thought and emotion. By observing fear instead of being swept away by it, he gained enough distance to modify its impact. The analysis of the fear of death led Montaigne to examine another essential component of the human experience: physical pain and its relationship to mental suffering. Since his youth, he had suffered from episodes of kidney stones that incapacitated him for hours. He noted the nature of the pain, its intensity, moments of relief, and its sudden fluctuations. But what interested him most was not describing the bodily discomfort, but observing the difference between the physical sensation and the mental interpretation that accompanied it. He discovered that pain increased when imagination intervened, when he projected future consequences, when he created narratives of personal injustice, or when he compared himself to an ideal state of being unaffected. Instead, when he limited himself to recording the pain as a present fact without adding expectations or judgments, the sensation lost some of its destructive power. This distinction between physical pain and mental suffering was consistent with his introspective method. Pain is a signal from the body. Suffering is a construction of thought that overlays that signal. Montaigne did not intend to deny the reality of pain or minimize it, but he showed that its experience depended as much on the emotional state as on the physiological cause. If judgment remained calm, pain became more manageable. This principle had roots in Stoic philosophy, which also distinguished between what affects the body and what affects the soul. But Montaigne diverged from them in a crucial aspect. The Stoics proposed an unbreakable strength in the face of adversity, a kind of emotional impermeability. Montaigne, on the other hand, accepted that pain affected him, that it caused fear, irritation, or dejection. He did not seek to overcome pain through hardening, but to understand how his own mind contributed to amplifying or attenuating it. While Stoicism privileged control, Montaigne privileged observation. This difference was deeper than it seems. For the Stoics, virtue consisted of completely separating rational judgment from the impact of external circumstances. For Montaigne, reason does not operate in a vacuum. It is intertwined with affections, habits, and the body. Philosophy should not impose an ideal of invulnerability, but rather help individuals navigate their natural vulnerability. In this sense, his position was more realistic than the Stoic one. He accepted human fragility not as a moral failure, but as a constitutive condition of life, and this acceptance, far from generating passivity, allowed for a more practical response that was more in line with reality. The same analysis led him to consider the instability of the world as an inevitable dimension of existence. His century was marked by abrupt changes, kings dying young, alliances shifting overnight, civil wars that destroyed entire cities and left regions under the control of fleeting factions. But instability was not limited to the political realm. It also affected the economy, the climate, and domestic life. Montaigne's experience was full of episodes that demonstrated the fragility of human plans, unexpected family conflicts, sudden illnesses, contradictory judicial decisions, or trivial accidents that altered entire routines. The accumulated observation of these events convinced him that the illusion of control was one of the main drivers of human suffering. Chance played an extremely broad role in his worldview, but far from seeing it as a threat, Montaigne understood it as a condition that demands adaptability. By recognizing the force of chance, he freed himself from the need to justify every event through moral or metaphysical causes. Life was not organized according to a discernible plan. It was the result of a combination of external factors, partial human decisions, and internal emotional reactions. Accepting this mix allowed for a more flexible life, without demanding coherence from the world that it could not offer. The introspective method articulated this understanding of chance. By examining the impulses that moved him, Montaigne noticed how many of them responded to contingent circumstances, a chance comment that changed his mood, a reading that altered his judgment, a physical discomfort that affected his perception of the surroundings. The mind reacted to multiple stimuli that it did not control. This observation did not lead him to paralyzing skepticism, but rather to a form of existential sobriety. The mind could act, but it could not fully govern even its own processes. From this, he derived a form of intellectual modesty that, paradoxically, strengthened his inner freedom. In the face of chance, Montaigne proposed an attitude combining lucidity and flexibility. Lucidity consisted in recognizing that life could change at any moment due to unforeseen causes. Flexibility consisted in adapting to those changes without degrading one's own integrity. This combination distinguished his view from passive fatalism, which renounces action. For him, human action was essential, but not as a conquest of the world, rather as participation in an unstable system where results were never guaranteed. Action was undertaken because acting was part of life, not because one expected to dominate the course of events. From this conception, he developed an ideal of serenity that did not depend on suppressing emotions or achieving total wisdom. Serenity arose from recognizing the limited scope of the will. This involved three operations: relativizing the importance of what does not depend on oneself, avoiding imaginative dramatization, and maintaining an inner space from which to observe one's own mental movements. These operations had a cumulative effect. They reduced the intensity of fear, moderated suffering, and conditioned the interpretation of chance. Serenity was not a permanent state, but a recurrent practice. The influence of the body on the mind became an essential part of this practice. Montaigne knew that he could not demand an order from the spirit that the body could not sustain. When health was fragile, the mind became more unstable. When aging advanced, memory lost strength, and the imagination took on new forms. Instead of fighting against these transformations, Montaigne sought to adjust his philosophy to them. Mortality, pain, and chance were not metaphysical adversaries but natural dimensions of the human condition. Wisdom had to adapt to their presence, not deny their existence. This perspective led him to redefine the notion of freedom. Freedom was not about mastering the body, controlling the world, or eliminating fears. It consisted in establishing a different relationship with what could not be changed. The mind, by observing its own functioning, acquired a margin of maneuver that it did not have when acting automatically. Montaigne did not aspire to invulnerability, but to a form of internal autonomy based on the understanding of limits. This autonomy formed within but had practical consequences. It made it possible to participate in public life with greater balance, to exercise responsibilities without falling into destructive ambitions, and to coexist with others without demanding perfections that one could not achieve. The development of this practical philosophy prepared the ground for the social and political dimension of his thinking. Living without fear was not only a personal achievement, it allowed for a clearer view of the conflicts of his time. An individual who understood the contingency of their judgments and the fragility of their emotions was less inclined to adopt dogmatic stances. An individual who accepted mortality and chance without dramatization was less vulnerable to the terrifying discourses that fueled civil wars. And an individual who distinguished between pain and mental suffering could endure the harshness of events better without resorting to violence to assert themselves. In this way, introspection ceased to be a solitary exercise and became the premise for more lucid coexistence. The transition to this public dimension would be the natural development of his thought. How an interior philosophy, centered on the observation of the mind and the acceptance of vulnerability, transforms into a reflection on tolerance, political prudence, and the need to moderate collective passions. This continuity would mark the move to the next stage of his work. Living with others, Montaigne's social philosophy. By the early 1580s, French life had fallen into a state of collective degradation that was difficult to reconstruct without resorting to exaggerations. Royal authority fluctuated between attempts at reconciliation and pressures from radical groups. Cities, divided internally, acted with increasing autonomy, and rural areas survived under improvised systems of protection. This was not spontaneous chaos, but an accumulated deterioration stemming from years of confessional conflicts that had eroded the basic trust required for any social order. Religious conflict acted as a catalyst, but what was crumbling was the very structure of civil life. The law lost its effectiveness, systems of mediation were disabled, and moral warnings were instrumentalized to justify new hostilities. This process of dissolution did not stem from a single cause, and precisely this multiplicity puzzled Montaigne. His main concern was not to describe each outburst of violence in detail, but to understand which internal mechanisms turned normal disagreements into irreconcilable enmities. He saw that doctrinal certainty acted as a trigger. Unlike other periods of crisis, this confrontation did not offer middle ground. Each side claimed to possess the correct interpretation of the divine will. Faith, which could have been a shared moral resource, transformed into an identity marker that nullified dialogue. For Montaigne, this phenomenon was not explained solely by ecclesiastical pressure or political dispute. It had deeper psychological roots, tied to the human tendency to seek absolute security in ideas that, by their nature, can never offer it. The introspective attitude Montaigne had developed in his retreat allowed him to apply this analysis to the public sphere. If the individual self is changeable and fallible, so too are collective opinions. The first lesson of his political thought derived from this observation. Without recognizing the insecurity of one's own judgment, civil coexistence degenerates into imposition. This epistemic humility became a critical tool for understanding the French conflict. It was not about defending comfortable indifference, but about reminding that no one has a total perspective on complex issues. Uncertainty, something many saw as a sign of weakness, was for Montaigne an essential component of political prudence. This principle was complemented by an unusual anthropological sensitivity. Montaigne examined travelers' accounts describing societies with radically different norms from those in Europe, using these differences to question the supposed universality of local customs. He did not draw an absolute relativist conclusion from this. Rather, he pointed out that human diversity required slow judgment and the capacity for comparison. If such different peoples could organize social life effectively, then one had to be wary of those who elevated their local habits to the status of eternal truths. From this perspective, the French wars were not only religious disputes, they were the extreme result of the inability to recognize that human values are plural. From this reflection arose a deep critique of dogmatism. Montaigne observed that when a belief is presented as unquestionable, it eliminates the possibility of correcting mistakes. This elimination generated visible political effects. Hasty decisions, disproportionate punishments, and public ceremonies of violence meant to demonstrate moral strength. For him, the root of fanaticism was not religious passion itself, but the closure of judgment it could induce. What destabilized the kingdom was not only doctrinal disagreement, but the conviction that disagreement was intolerable. The philosophical task was to reintroduce the intermediate space where doubt and reflection could operate. This effort to create space for reflection found concrete evidence in political practice. Elected mayor of Bordeaux in particularly difficult years, Montaigne faced tensions that could overwhelm the municipal administration. He knew that any decision could be interpreted as confessional favoritism and therefore provoke reprisals. His leadership was characterized by a constant insistence on moderation, not moderation understood as absolute neutrality, but as a method to prevent small incidents from escalating into irreversible proportions. Governing under these circumstances did not consist of applying a program, but in containing haste and providing time for collective emotions to cool. The effectiveness of this strategy depended less on formal authority than on personal trust, a trust Montaigne cultivated through direct relationships with various groups without rigidly aligning with any of them. His participation in diplomatic missions reflected the same attitude. He could converse with leaders of opposing confessions not because he sought to reconcile incompatible doctrines, but because he refused to turn differences into personal barriers. This ability to maintain cross-cutting connections placed him in a unique position within the French nobility. He was not a professional negotiator, but he understood that in a climate dominated by perceptions of threat, the mere possibility of conversation was already a political advance. The skepticism he applied to his own beliefs protected him from the rigidity that made many mediation attempts ineffective. Another key element of his social philosophy was the analysis of others' judgment as a psychological force. Montaigne knew that individuals live under constant pressure to assert themselves before others, a pressure that intensifies in unstable times. Reputation then becomes a kind of scarce commodity that must be defended continually. This dynamic produced corrosive effects, exaggeration of grievances, hostile interpretation of ambiguous gestures, and the need to respond to any sign of contempt. Political conflict fed on this logic. Small personal rivalries transformed into collective disputes because no one wanted to appear weak or indecisive. Montaigne saw in this mechanism a form of voluntary slavery. To regain the ability to coexist, it was necessary to learn not to depend on permanent approval. Freedom from social judgment did not lead to isolation, but to a more sober relationship with others. Those who do not feel compelled to constantly demonstrate strength are better prepared to act with equanimity. This inner independence allows one to listen without feeling threatened, negotiate without seeing concessions as defeats, and correct decisions without the fear of losing prestige. Montaigne had observed that most political errors did not stem from ignorance, but from the fear of appearing indecisive. The serenity he sought to cultivate was, in this sense, a condition for public prudence. His social critique did not propose a heroic ideal, but rather a way of inhabiting common life without allowing collective passions to capture the individual will. He believed that coexistence depended less on grand doctrines than on mental habits, the capacity to delay, the willingness to revise opinions, and attention to the complexity of situations. Philosophy, understood as the art of living, should provide tools to sustain these dispositions. Montaigne did not aim to reform the kingdom through political theories, but to show that exterior transformation begins with an inner transformation of perspective. In this regard, his French experience led him to conclude that human diversity is not an obstacle to be corrected, but an inevitable reality that requires flexibility. Conflicts do not disappear by decree, but they can be managed if one recognizes the limits of their own scope. Prudence, the central virtue in his social thought, was a form of continuous attention, an awareness that all judgments are provisional, and that circumstances change rapidly. In a world where rigid certainties destroyed communities, prudence became the highest political virtue. The transition from his inner work to this social philosophy shows a deep continuity. Observing his own mind taught him to distrust rigidity and recognize internal multiplicity. This learning naturally extended to the public sphere. Those who learn to coexist with themselves with a degree of indulgence can coexist with others without demanding impossible purities. The inner freedom he developed in his retreat offered the emotional foundation for less violent coexistence. He did not need to impose himself, he did not need to win, and he did not need to have absolute truth. The self that had learned not to dominate itself through force could also refrain from dominating others. This orientation sets the stage for the final reflection that Montaigne would develop, the idea of naturalness as the culmination of his philosophical project. Naturalness as final freedom in Montaigne's thought. Montaigne left the essays unfinished because his body no longer provided the strength to continue. The interruption is not an editorial accident, but the truest expression of his conception of the self, an identity that is never closed off, whose examination remains always in motion. In 16th century Europe, accustomed to treatises that sought to establish complete systems, this expansive and inconclusive form was perplexing, but precisely in this openness lies its originality. Montaigne understood that to describe subjectivity without distorting it requires accepting its constant metamorphosis, just as his introspective method, born in the Tower, consolidated in maturity, and projected towards human coexistence, had shown that the mind only recognizes itself when it abandons the pretense of absolute stability. In his later years, far from formulating a closed doctrine, Montaigne refined certain ethical preferences that responded both to his personal experience and to the devastated climate of France during the wars of religion. He favored intellectual frankness because he saw that self-deception, more than external circumstances, produces most of human unhappiness. He championed moderation in a country that had made excess a political and devotional habit, and he maintained a vigilant curiosity, convinced that a mind that stops questioning itself hardens and loses its ability to maneuver in the face of uncertainty. These inclinations, clarity, balance, openness, converged in what he called naturalness, a way of living that does not require renouncing culture or surrendering to impulses, but rather adjusting life to one's own constitution without subjecting it to external expectations. This inner adjustment did not equate to authenticity understood as spontaneous expression without filters, a concept that late modernity would exalt and trivialize. For Montaigne, living naturally meant freeing oneself from the invisible tribunal that watches every gesture and demands permanent coherence, unchanging strength, and adherence to heroic models that rarely match the true texture of everyday life. Naturalness emerges when the individual stops acting to impress and begins to orient themselves according to an honest evaluation of their inner movements. This orientation is not learned through obedience, but through observation, a direct continuation of the introspective method he had been refining since his retreat in 1571. The Renaissance humanism, with its reverence for classical antiquities, tended to propose the imitation of ancient models as a remedy for the moral corruption of the present. Montaigne, though a devoted reader of Plutarch, Seneca, and Lucretius, recognized the danger of reproducing overly rigid archetypes. Imposing an external ideal figure, the Stoic sage, the Roman citizen, the Ciceroan hero, broke the individual's inner continuity, forcing them into a sterile comparison with unreal patterns. Instead of projecting life into an external mold, naturalness demanded a critical reading of tradition, an inquiry into its contradictions, and the acceptance that the plurality of human temperaments makes a uniform pedagogy of virtue impossible. This gesture, subtle but decisive, distanced Montaigne from the dominant Renaissance moralism and brought him closer to a modern sensibility, the conviction that the self is multiple and that any rule must negotiate with that multiplicity. With this perspective, the project he began in his tower acquires a broader meaning. The study of mental fluctuations not only taught Montaigne to recognize himself, it allowed him to distinguish what truly belonged to his nature from what was mere cultural mimicry. Introspection thus became a tool to recover moral energy. By detecting what was forced, the individual stops maintaining exhausting fictions. Montaigne had observed that much of psychological fatigue comes from the effort to uphold imposed identities, political, religious, social, or even familial, that demand impossible coherence. Ultimately, naturalness names the reconciliation between this fluid self and a way of living that no longer seeks to justify itself before every external gaze. This reconciliation does not mean permanent balance. Montaigne knew that absolute stability is an illusion inherited from traditions that confused integrity with rigidity. For him, integrity consisted in maintaining an honest dialogue between present experience and inherited convictions, allowing that dialogue to transform both without dramatization. Life changes. Judgment must be able to change with it. This attitude, which to his 16th century readers might have seemed weakness, actually prefigures a proto-psychological approach, the self as process, not as substance. This approach led Montaigne to intuit phenomena that modern psychology would formalize centuries later. His insistence that suffering arises from interpretation rather than from the fact itself anticipates Aaron Beck's cognitive behavioral therapy, which identified distorted thought patterns as the source of many emotional disorders. Montaigne's disposition to observe without judgment is akin to the mindfulness practices introduced into Western medicine by John Kabat-Zinn, whose core idea involves distinguishing the present sensation from the imaginative proliferation that amplifies it. And when William James recognized in Principles of Psychology that Montaigne had understood the flow of consciousness like no one else, he retrospectively solidified the essayist's place in the genealogy of introspective psychology. At the same time, Montaigne's attention to cultural automatism coincides with intuitions that Pierre Bourdieu would later develop through the concept of habitus, those ingrained dispositions that guide our decisions without going through conscious reflection. Montaigne detected these mechanisms by observing how his opinions reproduced prejudices he believed were his own, but were in reality invisible inheritances from his environment. Nietzsche, a fervent reader of the essays, would see in this attitude a demystifying impulse similar to his own, distrust of absolute truths and the affirmation of a plural self, never identical to itself. Emerson, in turn, would turn Montaigne's inspiration into the foundation of American individualism. Each person must discover their own nature before submitting to collective conventions. And Foucault would place Montaigne within the transformation of technologies of the self, practices through which the individual constitutes themselves as a subject not for salvation, but for the lucid understanding of their experience. Naturalness, understood from this genealogy, is not indifference or abandonment, but a form of action stripped of the need for validation. When someone acts with the first thought being the impression they will create, their behavior becomes clumsy, as it attends more to the imagined audience than to the actual situation. Montaigne proposed reversing that order, to consider what the circumstance requires and only then, if necessary, attend to the opinion of others. In this way, action proceeds from an inner center and not from a carefully sustained mask. This orientation had political effects that Montaigne understood well. A community in which each individual is trapped in an immovable role is a rigid community, incapable of absorbing tensions. In contrast, a society where people can admit doubts, correct judgments, and adjust positions without fear of losing reputation becomes more resilient to conflict. Naturalness thus emerges as the synthesis of everything Montaigne had developed. Self-knowledge, a sober relationship with mortality, acceptance of chance, management of pain, and understanding of the social fabric. It is not a state that one ascends to all at once, but rather a habit that solidifies when the individual stops demonstrating absolute certainties, renounces identifying with unchanging ideals, and acknowledges that they do not control most of the events in their life. Through this, Montaigne imagined a space of coexistence where everyone accepts their fallibility and exercises constant vigilance against dogmatism. In a century marked by the demand for doctrinal uniformity, this gesture constituted an uncommon intellectual audacity. It allowed the conception of plurality not as a threat, but as an inevitable condition that must be negotiated without violence. The relevance of this lesson is especially clear in today's world. The World Health Organization recently identified anxiety as the most widespread mental condition on the planet. Its main causes, excessive social expectations, pressure to maintain coherent identities, and continuous exposure to public judgment reproduce in a digital key the dynamic Montaigne described with surprising precision, the exhaustion that comes from sustaining an image under the constant gaze of others. Social networks function as permanent tribunals where every statement is evaluated before unlimited audiences. The demand for absolute coherence turns any change of opinion into a suspicion of hypocrisy, and this horizontal surveillance, far from strengthening character, fragments it. In this context, Montaigne's invitation to live without the need to prove anything becomes more than relevant. It is a conceptual antidote to the anxiety generated by hyperexposure. Contemporary political polarization also reproduces the logic that Montaigne observed during the French Civil Wars. Opposing groups cling to immovable certainties, elevate their convictions to the status of essential identities, and turn disagreement into personal enmity. Against this dynamic, his insistence on epistemic humility, accepting that no perspective encompasses the entirety of reality, constitutes the minimum condition for dialogue. Recent studies in social psychology confirm Montaigne's intuition. Those who recognize the possibility of modifying their opinions in the face of new evidence show greater psychological well-being and more stable relationships. The willingness to revise beliefs, which Montaigne practiced with naturalness, thus reveals itself not only as an intellectual trait but as a civic virtue. The current landscape also includes a proliferation of self-optimization discourses that promise a definitive version of oneself through strict discipline, emotional control, or extreme productivity. The global personal development industry, with thousands of manuals and continuous improvement programs, feeds the idea that individual perfection is achievable if certain infallible methods are followed. Montaigne dismantled this illusion 4 centuries earlier. No system can fix a stable essence where only change exists. The naturalness he proposed did not seek an optimized self, but a self stripped of fictions, capable of accompanying its life rather than fighting it in the name of an imaginary ideal. This attitude does not imply moral laxity. Montaigne held difficult public offices and acted firmly when the situation demanded it. Naturalness, far from weakening responsibility, strengthens it. Those who know their limits and are not constantly concerned with external approval make decisions more clearly and accept consequences without dramatization. The key is that this firmness does not arise from rigidity, but from an orderly relationship with oneself. After decades of self-examination, Montaigne knew that judgment only works well when it is freed from unnecessary pressures. His death in 1592, without a final proclamation or grandiose gesture, was consistent with this philosophy. Life does not need solemn closures to possess meaning, just as it does not require a heroic narrative to justify itself.